Not the sharp cry of sudden pain, not the wail of grief. This was something older, something that carved its way through stone corridors and silk-draped chambers until every woman in the Golistan palace pressed her hands against her ears and prayed she would never understand what could produce such a sound. The guards outside the women's quarters stood rigid, their faces turned deliberately toward the courtyard fountains, toward anywhere but the latticed windows where that inhuman keening continued to rise and fall like a tide of broken glass. They had heard it before. They would hear it again, and each time they would tell themselves the same lie, that this was tradition, that this was necessary, that the empire's stability somehow required the systematic destruction of a 16-year-old girl's capacity to feel safe inside her own skin. If you found yourself drawn to the histories that empires tried to bury, hit that subscribe button now. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because I'm genuinely fascinated by how these forgotten stories are reaching people across every continent, connecting us through our shared refusal to let the powerful erase the suffering they orchestrated. This is one of those stories, the kind that survived not because it was recorded in official chronicles, but because it was whispered between sisters, preserved in the coded language of physicians' journals, hidden in the fragmentary letters of women who witnessed what happened behind palace walls and could never quite forget. This is the story of what the Qajar dynasty did to its daughters, not accidentally, not as an unfortunate byproduct of arranged marriage. What happened to Persian princesses in the decades before their wedding nights was deliberate, systematic, and so psychologically sophisticated that modern trauma researchers still study the mechanisms as textbook examples of coercive control. The girls who survived it were never the same. Many didn't survive it at all, not in any meaningful sense. And the women tasked with administering this destruction had themselves been broken by the same process, perpetuating trauma as inheritance, passing down techniques of psychological annihilation from generation to generation until the system became self-sustaining, requiring no justification beyond "this is how it has always been done." By the time Princess Zara was led to her husband's chambers on that November night in 1847, the girl she had been 6 months earlier had ceased to exist. The Qajar dynasty ruled Persia from 1789 to 1925, controlling an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the Caucasus Mountains to the borders of Afghanistan. For nearly a century and a half, they commissioned architectural wonders that still dominate Tehran's skyline, accumulated treasures that would later fill European museums, and wielded power through a combination of military force and strategic marriage alliances that bound provincial governors and military commanders to the throne through bonds of blood and obligation. In this empire, as in most dynasties built on hereditary power, daughters were born into a specific kind of servitude that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with political calculation. A princess of the Qajar court wasn't raised to rule. She was raised to be given away. Her education, her clothing, her daily routines, even the physical spaces she was permitted to occupy within the palace, all of it oriented toward a single inevitable moment, the transfer of her body from her father's household to her husband's chambers. The marriage itself would be decided in council meetings she would never attend, negotiated by men she barely knew, finalized before she was informed. She might be 13 or 16 or 19. She might be given to a military commander twice her age to secure an alliance with a northern province, or to a wealthy merchant's son to ensure financial support for the crown, or to a cousin to consolidate dynastic bloodlines. Her preference was so irrelevant to the equation that palace documents from this period rarely even record the bride's name until after the marriage contract was signed. But the Qajars understood something that many dynasties either didn't grasp or chose to ignore. A young woman with an intact will, with autonomous thoughts, with the capacity to resist, was a political liability. She might refuse, she might shame her family through visible reluctance. She might produce the wrong kind of heir by maintaining enough psychological independence to form attachments, preferences, opinions. So the system developed protocols. Not written protocols, nothing so vulnerable to later examination, but practices transmitted woman to woman, refined through generations of application, perfected until they could reliably produce the desired result. A bride so thoroughly broken that compliance became her only remaining behavioral option. The preparation began the moment a girl's engagement was announced. Sometimes she would have months of warning, sometimes only weeks. But the timeline was carefully calculated to provide exactly enough time for complete psychological restructuring without allowing so much time that the trauma might begin to integrate or heal. 6 months was standard. 6 months from announcement to wedding night. 6 months for the older women of the palace, the overseers of brides, the mistresses of ritual, the guardians of propriety, to systematically dismantle everything the girl understood about safety, autonomy, and her right to exist as a person rather than a function. They began with her voice. Within the first week of preparation, a princess would find that her vocabulary had been reduced to 43 approved phrases, responses to questions, expressions of gratitude, requests for permission, apologies for inadequacy. Yes, as you wish. Forgive my failure. Thank you for your guidance. With permission, may I? Anything beyond this narrow linguistic range would trigger immediate consequences. Not violence, not at first. Isolation. A girl who spoke out of turn would spend the remainder of the day alone in her chamber, excluded from meals, invisible to the other young women undergoing preparation alongside her. Those other girls, always present, always watching, had been instructed that one woman's transgression threatened everyone's successful conditioning. They learned to police each other, to view shared suffering not as grounds for solidarity, but as competition for the limited approval available from their supervisors. The restriction of language wasn't about etiquette. It was about cognitive destruction. Human consciousness maintains coherence through internal narrative, through the ability to articulate thoughts and thereby process experience. When you can name what you're feeling, you maintain psychological continuity. You know who you are. By reducing a princess to 43 phrases, the system severed her connection to her own internal experience. She couldn't articulate her fear, so the fear metastasized into something larger than language could contain. She couldn't express confusion, so confusion became her permanent state. She couldn't defend herself verbally, so the concept of defense itself began to erode from her psychological repertoire. Simultaneously, they restructured her physical existence. 3 hours each morning were devoted to what the palace women called the 8 movements of submission. These weren't simple bows or gestures of respect. Each movement had been choreographed with obsessive precision, designed to express a specific form of subordination, practiced until they became neurologically automatic. The greeting bow, where the eyes must lower before the torso bends, never the reverse. The serving position, where the spine curves forward and the hands extend palm upward at precisely waist height. The retreat, where she must move backward without turning, and physically awkward motion that required her to remain perpetually oriented toward authority even as she withdrew from it. Her neck angle was measured, 30 degrees of downward tilt in the presence of male authority. Not 25, which suggested insufficient deference. Not 35, which implied theatrical performance of submission rather than genuine internalization. Exactly 30 degrees. Her steps were limited to the length of her own foot, small shuffling movements that made her slower, more careful, less capable of moving through space with confidence or purpose. Her hands could never rise above the level of her heart. The symbolic logic was transparent. A woman's gestures must never aspire to heights occupied by will or autonomy. Hour after hour, day after day, Princess Zara repeated these movements until her muscles ached and her mind went blank. The older women circled her with the patience of people performing a task they had perfected through repetition, occasionally stopping her to adjust an angle, to press her spine into a more curved position, to slap her wrist down when it drifted too high. "You're too straight," one supervisor would say, pushing Zara's shoulders forward. A proper wife understands her place in relation to the ground. The corrections were paired with public humiliation. When Zara's step showed too much confidence, all the other girls in preparation would be summoned to watch her repeat the movement while the overseer narrated her failure. "This is what pride looks like," the woman would announce. "This is the walk of someone who hasn't yet learned that her body exists to serve, not to move with purpose." What was happening at the muscular level went deeper than etiquette training. The body, when subjected to repetitive positioning, internalizes the messages those positions communicate. Trauma researchers have documented how victims of prolonged coercion develop postural habits that persist decades after the abuse ends. Perpetual tension in the shoulders, habitual lowering of the gaze, automatic retreat from physical proximity. The Qajar preparation protocols understood this principle before Western psychology had vocabulary for it. By training Zara's body to move in these submissive patterns, they were rewriting her at the neurological level, installing an automatic subordination that would persist even in moments when no one was watching, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Then came what the palace women called the testing. This was presented as practice for her future husband's expectations, but its actual function was to create a permanent state of hypervigilance, to ensure that Zara's nervous system remained in constant alarm even during supposedly safe moments. An older woman named Mayhin, who had been through this preparation herself 40 years earlier and now administered it with the cold efficiency of someone who had survived by becoming the instrument of her own destruction, would role-play scenarios that Zara would allegedly face after marriage. But Mahin never played the husband as reasonable or predictable. She performed him as capriciously cruel, impossible to satisfy, his approval contingent on factors Zara could neither understand nor control. Zara would approach as instructed, bow at the proper angle, speak her permitted phrases with perfect diction. And then, without any variation in her performance to justify the shift, Mahin's expression would harden. "That was inadequate," she would say, her voice like frost forming on glass. "Your husband will be disgusted by your clumsiness. Do you understand what happens to wives who disappoint? They are replaced. They are returned to their families in shame. They disappear into the parts of the palace where no one speaks their names." The threat would hang in the air, specific enough to terrify but vague enough that Zara's imagination would complete the horror. Sometimes the testing involved deliberate traps. Mahin would intentionally perform an action incorrectly and then berate Zara for failing to correct her. "A good wife anticipates," she would snarl. "A good wife sees what her husband needs before he knows it himself. You stood there like livestock while I made a fool of myself." Other times, the cruelty was even more sophisticated. Mahin would simply stop acknowledging Zara's existence, would speak about her to other women as though the girl had become invisible. "I can barely stand to look at her anymore," Mahin would say while Zara stood 3 feet away. Her future husband will regret this arrangement. Poor man, bound to such an inadequate creature. These moments of total social erasure triggered something close to psychological death. Human beings are social animals. Connection is as fundamental as oxygen. To be in a room with other people and have them collectively decide you don't exist creates a particular kind of anguish that leaves no physical marks but inflicts lasting damage. Zara would stand there, trying to maintain the proper posture, trying not to let her face show the rising panic while the women who controlled every aspect of her existence discussed her worthlessness as though she had already ceased to be a person. The testing happened at random intervals, which intensified its psychological impact. Zara could be pulled aside during a meal, interrupted during sleep, confronted while moving through corridors. The unpredictability itself was a weapon. Her nervous system learned that nowhere was safe, that rest was impossible, that every moment contained the potential for sudden humiliation. Within 3 months, she had stopped sleeping properly. She would lie awake until dawn, her heart racing, her mind cycling through every possible scenario of failure. When she did sleep, she woke at 3 in the morning drenched in sweat, gasping, with no memory of what had triggered the panic, but with the certainty that something irreversible was happening to her consciousness. The palace physicians who examined her weekly noted this deterioration with clinical detachment. Dr. Mirza Taghi, who had served the Qajar court for 30 years and had examined perhaps 100 brides in preparation, recorded in his private journal that Zara exhibited the appropriate progression of psychological adjustment necessary for marital compliance. He measured her pulse, which had become permanently elevated. He documented her weight loss, the result of months of suppressed appetite and constant anxiety. He performed internal examinations that violated every boundary she possessed, making absolutely clear that her body was no longer her own, but had become state property to be assessed and documented like any other imperial asset. After these examinations, Zara would sit alone in her chamber and experience a dissociation so profound it felt like watching her own life from behind thick glass. She would look at her hands and not quite recognize them as belonging to her. She would touch her own face and feel the sensation as though it were happening to someone else. This dissociation was her mind's most powerful survival mechanism, the only defense remaining when every external resistance had been systematically crushed. But it came at a permanent cost. The fragmentation it created, the separation between conscious awareness and physical experience, would never fully heal. Princess Ashraf, who had undergone preparation in 1823, left a diary that was discovered in palace archives nearly 2 centuries later. The entries begin with clear, articulate observations about poetry and astronomy. By month 4 of her preparation, the handwriting has deteriorated into disconnected fragments. Cannot remember why I moved this way. When did my body stop being mine? Always watched. Not myself. By month 6, the entries stop completely. The last legible sentence reads, "There is no one left inside to write." Princess Fatima, prepared for marriage in 1856, attempted to hide in the palace gardens on her wedding night. She was found after several hours in a state that the physician's report described as complete catatonic withdrawal. She didn't speak for 3 weeks. When her voice returned, she used only the 43 approved phrases, nothing more, as though the preparation had succeeded so thoroughly that, even after its formal conclusion, she couldn't access any other form of speech. Princess Nosrat, married in 1841, was described by her sister as moving through the palace like a doll manipulated by invisible strings, speaking only when addressed, as though the part of her that once laughed had been surgically removed. These weren't anomalies. They were the intended outcome. The Qajar dynasty understood human psychology with terrifying precision. They knew that anticipation of violation often destroyed more completely than violence itself. By the time Princess Zara was led to her husband's chamber in 1847, she had already been erased. What happened that night only confirmed what 6 months of calculated preparation had achieved. Hassan Khan entered, partially drunk, performed the ritual, and left. The women checked the sheets, declared the night a success. But the screaming that echoed through Golistan Palace hours later wasn't from the act itself. It came when Zara's dissociation finally shattered, when 6 months of terror broke through all at once. By morning, she was sedated. Within weeks, she lived in a fog of obedience. She bore children, fulfilled every duty, and was praised as an ideal wife. But the girl who once loved mathematics and asked about the stars had died long before her body did. The Qajars perfected psychological breaking long before modern science named it. Restrict the voice, control the body, make punishment unpredictable, isolate, confuse, and teach the victim to police herself. They called it preparation. It was annihilation. These methods did not vanish with the fall of the dynasty. Intelligence agencies studied them. Cult leaders used them. Abusers learned to disguise them as devotion, protection, or love. The art of destroying autonomy without leaving bruises became a transferable skill, a legacy masquerading as tradition. In the Golistan archives, a wedding ledger lists every cost: silk for the gown, gold for embroidery, flowers for the ceremony. But nowhere is the cost of the bride's destruction recorded. It required no ink, no coin, only silence. That absence is the most truthful record of all proof that some violence hides best by pretending to be normal. The palace still stands. Tourists walk its corridors photographing fountains and tilework, but if the wind moves just right, something remains a sound between scream and silence. The sound of what empires do to daughters. A reminder that what was once called refinement was, in truth, the perfecting of cruelty, the breaking of human will disguised as civilization.